Okay, how's it going, everybody? So we're going to read some Lenin today. This is Political Agitation in the Class Point of View. This is this was, what year is this? I believe 1902. 1902. It was published in Iskra before Lenin left Iskra. So let's go ahead and get into this. Let us begin with an illustration. The reader will remember the sensation that was created by the speech delivered by M.A. Stakovich, Marshal of the Nobility of Orel Gubernera, at a missionary congress, in the course of which he urged that freedom of conscience be recognized by law. The conservative press, led by Moskovsky Vedomosti, is conducting a furious campaign against Mr. Stakovich. It cannot find names vile enough with which to call him, and almost goes so far as to accuse the entire Orel nobility of high treason for having re-elected Mr. Stakovich as marshal. Now this re-election is indeed very significant, and to a certain degree it bears the character of a demonstration of the nobility against police tyranny and outrage. Stakovich, says Moskovsky Vedomosti, quote, is not so much marshal of the nobility as Osoge Misha Stakovich, the life and soul of the party, the clever conversationalist. Number 348, 1901. So much the worse for you, gentlemen, defenders of the bludgeon. Even if our jovial landlords begin to talk about freedom of conscience, then the infamies of the priest and the police must verily be without number. Quote, what does our intellectual, frivolous crowd that instigates and applauds the Stakoviches care for the affairs of our sacred Orthodox faith and our time-honored attitude towards it, end quote. Once again, so much the worse for you, gentlemen, champions of the autocracy, the Orthodox faith, and the national essence. A fine system indeed our police-ridden autocracy must be, if it has permeated even religion, with the spirit of the prison cell, so that the Stakoviches, who have no firm convictions in matters of religion, but who are interested, as we shall see, in preserving a stable religion, become utterly indifferent, if not actually hostile to this notorious, quote, national faith. They call our faith a delusion, quote, it says here, quote, they call our faith a delusion. They mock at us because thanks to this delusion, we fear and try to avoid sin, and we carry out our obligations uncomplainingly, no matter how severe they may be, because we find the strength and courage to bear sorrow and privations, and forbear pride in times of success and good fortune, end quote. So, the Orthodox faith is dear to them because it teaches people to bear misery, quote, uncomplainingly, end quote. What a profitable faith it is indeed for the governing classes. In a society so organized that an insignificant minority enjoys wealth and power, while the masses constantly suffers privations and bear severe obligations, it is quite natural for the exploiters to sympathize with the religion that teaches people to bear uncomplainingly the hell on earth for the sake of an alleged celestial paradise. But in its zeal, Moskovsky Vedomosti became too garrulous. So garrulous, in fact, that unwittingly it spoke the truth. We read on, quote, they do not suspect that if they, the Stakoviches, eat well, sleep peacefully, and live merrily, it is thanks to this delusion, end quote. The sacred truth. This is precisely the case. It is because religious delusions are so widespread among the masses that the Stakoviches and Oblomovs and all our capitalists who live by the labor of the masses, and even Moskovsky Vedomosti itself, quote, sleep peacefully, end quote. And the more education spreads among the people, the more will religious prejudices give way to socialist consciousness. The nearer will be the day of victory for the proletariat. The victory that will emancipate all oppressed classes from the slavery they endure in modern society. But having blurted out the truth on one point, Moskovsky Vedomosti disposed far too easily of another interesting point. It is obviously mistaken in believing that the Stakoviches, quote, do not realize, end quote, the significance of religion that they demand, liberal forms out of sheer, quote, thoughtlessness, end quote. Such an interpretation of a hostile political trend is too childishly naive. The fact in this instance, Mr. Stakovich came forward as an advocate of the entire liberal trend was proved best of all by Moskovsky Vedomosti itself. Otherwise, what need was there for waging such a campaign against a single speech? What need was there for speaking not about Stokovich, but about the Stokoviches, about the intellectual crowd, end quote. Moskovsky Vedomosti's error was, of course, deliberate. That paper is more unwilling than it is unable to analyze the liberalism it baits from the class point of view. That it does not desire to do so goes without saying, but its inability to do so interests us very much more, because this is a complaint that even very many revolutionaries and socialists suffer from. Thus, the authors of the letter published in number 12 of Iskra, who accuse us of departing from, quote, the class point of view, end quote, for striving in our newspaper to follow all manifestations of liberal discontent and protest, suffer from this complaint, as do also the authors of Proletarskaya Borba and of several pamphlets in, quote, the Social Democratic Library, end quote, who imagine that our autocracy represents the absolutist rule of the bourgeoisie. Likewise, the Martinovs, who seek to persuade us to abandon the many-sided campaign of exposure, i.e., the widest possible political agitation, against the autocracy, and to concentrate our efforts mainly upon the struggle for economic reforms, to give something positive to the working class, to put forward in its name concrete demands for legislative and administrative measures, quote, which promise certain palpable results, end quote. Likewise, too, the Nadestins, who, on reading the correspondence in our paper on the statistical conflicts, ask in astonishment, quote, good Lord, what is this, a Simstow paper, end quote. All these socialists forget that the interests of the autocracy coincide only with certain interests of the proper-tied classes. In only certain circumstances, frequently it happens that its interests do not coincide with the interests of these classes as a whole, but only with those of certain of their strata, the interests of other bourgeois strata. In the more widely understood interest of the entire bourgeoisie of the development of capitalism as a whole, necessarily give rise to a liberal opposition to the autocracy. For instance, the autocracy guarantees the bourgeoisie opportunities to employ the crudest forms of exploitation, but on the other hand, it places 1,000 obstacles in the way of the extensive development of the productive forces and the spread of education. In this way, it arouses against itself, not only the petty bourgeois, but at times even the big bourgeoisie. The autocracy guarantees the bourgeoisie protection against socialism. But since the people are deprived of rights, this protection is necessarily transformed into a system of police outrages that rouse the indignation of the entire people. What the result of these antagonistic tendencies is, what relative strength of conservative and liberal views or trends among the bourgeoisie obtains at the present moment, cannot be learned from a couple of general theses. For this depends on all the special features of the social and political situation at a given moment. To determine this, one must study the situation in detail and carefully watch all the conflicts with the government, no matter by what social stratum they are initiated. It is precisely the class point of view that makes it impermissible for a social democrat to remain indifferent to the discontent and the protests of the Stokoviches. The reasoning and activity of the above-mentioned socialists show that they are indifferent to liberalism and thus reveal their incomprehension of the basic thesis of the Communist Manifesto, the gospel of international social democracy. Let us recall, for instance, the words that the bourgeoisie itself provides material for the political education of the proletariat by its struggle for power, by the conflicts of various strata and groups within it, etc. Only in politically free countries has the proletariat easy access to this material, then only to part of it. In enslaved Russia, however, we social democrats must work hard to obtain this material for the working class, i.e., we must ourselves undertake the task of conducting general political agitation, of carrying on a public exposure campaign against the autocracy. This task is particularly imperative in periods of political ferment. We must bear in mind that in 1 year of intensified political life, the proletariat can obtain more revolutionary training than several years of political calm. For this reason, the tendency of the above-mentioned socialists, consciously or unconsciously, to restrict the scope of content of political agitation is particularly harmful. Let us recall also the words that the communists support every revolutionary movement against the existing system. Those words are often interpreted too narrowly and are not taken to imply support for the liberal opposition. It must not be forgotten, however, that there are periods when every conflict with the government arising out of progressive social interests, however small, may under certain conditions, of which our support is one, flare up into general conflagration. Suffice it to recall the great social movement which developed in Russia out of the struggle between the students and the government over academic demands, or the conflict that arose in France between all the progressive elements and the militarists, who over a trial in which the verdict had been rendered on a basis of forged evidence. Hence, it is our bounden duty to explain to the proletariat every liberal and democratic protest, to widen and support it, with the active participation of the workers, be it a conflict between the Simsto and the Ministry of the Interior, between the nobility and the police regime of the Orthodox Church, between statisticians and the bureaucrats, between peasants and the Simsto officials, between religious sects and the rural police, etc., etc. Those who contemptuously turn up their noses at the slight importance of some of these conflicts, or at the hopelessness of the attempts to fan them into a general conflagration, do not realize that all-sided political agitation is a focus in which the vital interests of political education of the proletariat coincide with the vital interests of the social development as a whole, of the entire people, that is, of all its democratic elements. It is our direct duty to concern ourselves with every liberal question, to determine our social democratic attitude towards it, to help the proletariat to take an active part in its solution, and to accomplish the solution in its own proletarian way. Those who refrain from concerning themselves in this way, whatever their intentions in actuality, leave the liberals in command, place their hands the political education of the workers, and concede the hegemony in the political struggle to elements which, in the final analysis, are leaders of bourgeois democracy. The class character of the social democratic movement must not be expressed in the restriction of our task to the direct and immediate needs of the labor movement, pure and simple. It must be expressed in our leadership of every aspect and every manifestation of the great struggle for liberation that is being waged by the proletariat, the only truly revolutionary class in modern society. Social democracy must constantly and unswervingly spread the influence of the labor movement to all spheres of the social and political life of contemporary society. It must lead not only the economic but also the political struggle of the proletariat. It must never for a moment lose sight of our ultimate goal, but always carry on propaganda for the proletarian ideology, the theory of scientific socialism, viz. Marxism, guard it against distortion, and develop it further. We must entirely combat any and every bourgeois ideology, regardless of the fashionable and striking garb in which it may drape itself. The socialists we have mentioned above depart from the class point of view, also because and to the extent that they remain indifferent to the task of combating the criticism of Marxism. Only the blind fail to see that this criticism has taken root rapidly in Russia than in any other country, and has been more enthusiastically taken up by Russian liberal propaganda than by any other, precisely for the reason that it is one of the elements of the bourgeois, now consciously bourgeois, democracy, now information in Russia. It is particularly in regard to the political struggle that the class point of view demands that the proletariat give an impetus to every democratic movement. The political demands of working class democracy do not differ in principle from those of bourgeois democracy. They differ only in degree. In the struggle for economic emancipation, for the socialist revolution, the proletariat stands on a basis different in principle, and it stands alone. The smaller producer will come to its aid only to the extent that he enters, or is preparing to enter, its ranks. In the struggle for political liberation, however, we have many allies towards whom we must not remain indifferent. But while our allies in the bourgeois democratic camp, in struggling for liberal reforms, will always glance back and seek to adjust matters, so that they will be able, as before, quote, to eat well, sleep peacefully, and live merrily, end quote. At other people's expense, the proletariat will march forward to the end, without looking back. While the confreres of RNS, author of the preface to the Witt's memorandum, haggle with the government over the rights of the authoritative Simsto or over a constitution, we will struggle for the democratic republic. We will not forget, however, that if we want to push someone forward, we must continuously keep our hands on that someone's shoulders. The party of the proletariat must learn to catch every liberal just at the moment when he is prepared to move forward an inch, and make him move forward a yard. If he is obdurate, we will go forward without him and over him. Okay, yeah. So that is political agitation and the class point of view. This is 1902 by V.I. Lenin. Thank y'all for tuning in. Follow me online, Facebook, like the page, Twitter. Follow me on there. YouTube, subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell. Medium, I think, how do you do that? Subscribe to it. I got stories on there. And so, thank y'all. All those remarks I saw, hit me up there. Y'all have a great day, and do Dadagoy.